Take a slow breath, wherever you are right now, under a blanket, curled up on a pillow, or simply taking a quiet moment to rest. You don't have to do anything else. There's nothing you need to remember, and nowhere you need to be. Tonight we're stepping into a world far older than calendars and cities. A time before streetlights, before writing, before anyone carved a name into stone. A world lit by early dawn and soft firelight, where people lived close to the land, close to each other, and close to the simple rhythm of day and night. And even though the world was different, the people were still human. They watched the sky, they shared food, they cared for their children. They laughed when something was funny. They felt tired at the end of the day and relieved when they reached warmth and shelter. In the quiet hours, they listened to the wind outside and the breathing of the group nearby, safe enough for now to let sleep come. So get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, let your thoughts slow down, and when you're ready, we'll go back, quietly, into the deep past. Long before kingdoms, long before cities, long before anyone wrote a name into clay or carved a law into stone, a man walks across open ground beneath a fading sky. He is not a king. He is not a hero in the way later ages would define one. No one records his victories. No one paints his face. No one tells his story in words that survive. And yet, he is part of the oldest story we have. He moves with the patience of someone who knows the land by signs so small they would be invisible to most eyes. A bent stem, a disturbed patch of dust, the faint print of an animal's hoof, softened by wind but still readable if the light strikes from the right angle. The day is cooling now. Behind him, further back than the eye can easily measure in the low light, a small group follows at a slower pace.
Kriga bundolo, malawuts.
Naktu framf, grognakt.
2 women, an older man, and a boy who keeps drifting ahead and being called back with a quiet sound. They are not a crowd. Human groups in this world are small. That is one of the first things future people would struggle to feel in their bones when trying to imagine this time. How much land there was, and how few humans upon it. Not empty, exactly.
Skatach kvash.
Tach, grun, chemrak.
Hagulnar.
The world is full of movement. Birds, insects, grazing animals, predators in shadow, wind in grass, weather gathering beyond the horizon. But human life is scattered, light on the earth, spread wide. The hunter carries a stone point fitted to a shaft. It is worn smooth, where his hand has held it over and over again. The tool is not crude, it is practical, shaped with intention. A flake struck from a prepared core, an edge maintained, a form repeated because repetition teaches reliability. No one here uses words like innovation or technology, but they know skill. They know which stone breaks cleanly and which one shatters wrong. They know how to shape wood by heat. They know how to carry fire and how to protect it. They know where water lingers later into the dry season, and which roots become dangerous after rain. This knowledge does not sit in books. It lives in bodies, in habit, in memory, in watching, in being corrected, in trying again. The hunter slows as the ground rises. Ahead, the dark line of stone becomes clearer, an outcrop cut by time and weather, its face broken by hollows and openings. Not all of them are useful. Some are too shallow. Some hold old smells that warn of other occupants. Some collect damp air and insects and little else. But one of them tonight will do. The cave is still some distance away. He does not look at it as a home, not in the way later humans would speak of houses. There are no walls built by his hand, no doorway he owns, no fixed bed waiting for him. This place is shelter, pause, memory. A stopping point in a life shaped by movement. He glances toward the sky. The light has thinned into blue-grey. The first evening calls rise from somewhere beyond the brush. The boy behind him stumbles, regains his balance, and laughs at himself before anyone else can. The older man says something low and dry that makes one of the women smile. Their voices are soft, not because they are always afraid, but because sound carries. The hunter listens as he walks. That too is survival, not constant fear. Not a frantic race from one danger to the next, as later stories would exaggerate. Most days are not dramatic. Most days are made of ordinary decisions. Where to step, when to wait, whether to push farther before dark or turn back now. Who is tired? Who is hungry? Who needs help carrying what remains of the day's gathering? This is one of the quiet truths of early human life. Survival is rarely one grand heroic act. It is mostly attention, lingers in some surfaces, and leaves others already cold. The entrance is wide enough for several people to pass through at once, but low enough in places that the hunter dips his head out of habit. Inside, shadows settle quickly. There is an old fire scar near the entrance from a previous stay, char and ash packed into a shallow depression. Whether it was their group or another, he cannot know with certainty, but the sign is familiar. This place has held people before. It may hold people again after them. The older man kneels first, touching the ash, feeling what remains. One of the women sets down a bundle of gathered roots and dry plant matter. The boy hovers, restless, wanting to help, then wanting to be outside, then wanting to stand close enough to watch every movement. The hunter leaves again for a moment to gather more fuel from the edge of the slope, where brush has dried enough to catch quickly. When he returns, the first ember has taken. Then comes that small, immediate transformation only fire can make. Darkness pulls back. Stone begins to glow in patches. Faces emerge and disappear as flames shift. The cave becomes not just an opening in rock, but a place arranged by light. Smoke lifts toward the mouth and curls there before slipping into the night air. The group settles by degrees, the way people always do when a day is ending. No signal marks the transition. There is no command. It is a pattern older than memory. Set things down, check the fire, sort food, call children closer, listen to the night beyond the light. Beside him, the older man rubs his shoulder and rotates the arm slowly, working out stiffness earned over years of use. The boy finally receives a task, to bring in a few smaller sticks and stay within sight, and takes it with sudden seriousness. Somewhere deeper in the cave, a baby begins to cry and is comforted almost at once. The sound echoes differently here. Future archaeologists, if they stood in such a place, would notice other things first. Layers of sediment, burned bone, stone flakes, charcoal, pollen traces perhaps, the quiet evidence that can be measured, sorted, dated, compared. But what those layers once contained is this: the ordinary sound of people ending a day. A laugh too loud, then shushed. A child asking for more than there is. Someone humming without thinking. A hand passing food across firelight. A glance toward the cave mouth when a branch cracks outside. No one in this cave believes they are living in a missing age. That phrase belongs to much later minds, to people looking backward at deep time and finding long stretches where the record grows thin. Thin enough to invite confusion. Thin enough to tempt dramatic explanations. Thin enough to make absence feel like mystery. But absence is not emptiness. The hunter tears a piece of cooked root and eats slowly. The food is plain, fibrous, warm from the edge of the fire. There may be meat some nights, little on others. There are days of plenty and days of strain. The world is not gentle. Injuries happen. Weather turns. Predators test boundaries. Children fall sick. Elderly bodies tire. And still, life here is not the endless panic later imagination likes to paint. There is labour, yes, there is vigilance, there is uncertainty, but there is also rhythm. The hunter's band knows when to move and when to stay. They know who wakes easily in the night and who sleeps hard. They know who remembers paths, who spots tracks first, who notices weather, who can calm a frightened child, who can coax flame from reluctant fuel. This is not a collection of isolated individuals. It is a social world. An effort leaves fewer clean traces than a shaped blade, but it is the larger force. A single person can carry a tool. A group carries a life. As the fire burns lower, the cave settles into a different kind of quiet. Not silence, layered quiet. Breathing. Occasional movement. A soft cough. The scrape of stone set aside. The boy, finally exhausted, sleeping before he means to. The hunter still awake, still angled toward the entrance, watching the dark as if it might answer a question. Outside, night thickens over the land. The stars are not hidden by city light. They stretch unbroken, cold and numerous, over plains and hills and waterlines that future maps will name differently. The coast itself may be miles away from where later generations expect it, because this world's shorelines are not fixed. Ice gathers and melts across ages. Seas rise and fall. Camps once near the water may one day lie beneath it. This is one reason so much of early human life is hard to recover. The best places to live are often the hardest places to preserve. The hunter does not know this. He cannot know that the earth will keep some traces and erase others with total indifference. He cannot know that caves like this, by chance more than intention, will become archives. Stone protects what open ground loses. A fire pit sealed under layers can wait. A dropped flake can survive. A bone, if conditions are right, can endure long enough to be found by hands separated from its owner by tens of thousands of years. And even then, only fragments remain. A point, a patch of charcoal, a stained layer of ash, a shell bead in the wrong place for accident, an engraved line on ochre that suggests someone, somewhere, made a mark for more than utility. From such things, later humans build stories carefully, then rebuild them when new evidence arrives. The hunter shifts, feeds another piece of wood into the fire, and watches sparks rise. He does not know he is standing near the edge of a long historical misunderstanding. Future people will look at the gaps and ask what happened in the missing years, as if nothing happened at all. But everything happened. Days like this happened. Small decisions happened. Meals shared in firelight happened. Tools repaired, children corrected, elders consulted, roots remembered, grief carried, laughter returned. These happened. What is missing is not life. What is missing is the record. At last the hunter lies down near the warmth of the cave wall, one arm folded under his head, his tool within reach. The fire lowers to embers. Someone else will wake later and feed it. Someone always does. Beyond the entrance, wind moves across the slope, rearranging dust, softening tracks, beginning already the slow work of erasure. Inside the cave, ash settles gently over the remains of the evening. And in that ash, though no one here can know it, the first clues are waiting. By morning the cave looks different. The fire has collapsed into a bed of pale ash, with a dull orange glow, hidden deep beneath it. The smoke smell remains, caught in the stone, mixed now with the cooler scent of damp earth and old mineral dust. Near the entrance, light arrives slowly, not all at once. It creeps across uneven ground, reaches a wall, pauses there, and begins to reveal what the dark had flattened. The hunter wakes before the light fully reaches him, not because of a clock, not because of a bell, because the cave is changing. Someone is already moving near the embers, stirring ash, coaxing heat back into flame. A child turns in sleep. The older man coughs once, low and dry, and then sits up with the familiar care of a body that has worked for many seasons. The hunter pushes himself upright and looks toward the mouth of the cave, where the sky outside is still a soft grey. For the people inside it, the cave is shelter first, a break from wind, a wall at their backs, a place where firelight can be held. But for the people who will come much later, people with brushes, measuring tools, notebooks, microscopes and patient hands, the cave will be something else. It will be a memory, not a perfect one, not a complete one, but more memory than the open plain can usually keep. That is the first great difference between the cave and the rest of the world. Open ground is exposed to everything. Wind strips surfaces, rain shifts soil, roots break through old layers. Hooves crush what was left behind. Scavengers drag bone. Sun, heat, flood, frost, and time all work without rest. A campsite on open ground may hold 100 small signs of life, one evening, and almost none a few seasons later. But caves sometimes protect. They do not protect out of kindness. Stone is not careful in that way. Caves flood. Caves collapse. Animals den in them. Moisture can ruin what dryness might have preserved. bats, insects, and shifting sediments can disturb old layers. Yet compared with open landscapes, some caves offer a kind of accidental shelter for evidence. And in prehistory, accident matters. The hunter stands and steps over the sleeping child, careful not to disturb him. Near the fire scar, he sees yesterday's work in small fragments. Bits of charcoal, a split bone, tiny flakes struck from stone while tool edges were repaired. Nothing here looks important. Nothing glows with significance. That is another quiet truth of archaeology. The past usually survives in pieces too small to impress at first glance. Later, when archaeologists study caves, they often begin with the ground itself, not the dramatic image people expect. No immediate skeleton, no treasure hidden in shadow, but layers. Earth laid down over earth, ash beneath dust, dust beneath fallen grit, sometimes thousands of years compressed into sediments no thicker than a handspan, if laid gently enough and left undisturbed long enough. To the hunter, the cave floor is simply ground. To a future archaeologist, it may be a timeline. A fire here, another there years later, a different tool style in a lower layer, pollen trapped in sediment from a season of flowering long gone, charred seed fragments hinting at what was brought in and eaten, a change in animal bone, cut marks showing new habits or different prey. Caves do not preserve whole lives, they preserve interruptions. That is why they matter so much. Most early human life did not happen inside caves. People moved through grasslands, coastlines, woodlands, river valleys. They worked, rested, argued, nursed children, repaired tools, and slept in places that left little trace. If we rely only on cave evidence, we are seeing a partial map. But a partial map is still better than blankness. The hunter crouches near the entrance and studies the weather. Thin cloud, a cooler breeze. Good for travel if they move today. Behind him, the others begin the slow work of mourning. Food is checked, embers fed, a carrying bundle tied tighter, a tool passed over for repair. The cave, for a brief time, becomes busy in the quiet, efficient way of shared routine. When they leave, much of that routine will disappear. Footprints near the mouth may last until wind rises. The warmth of bodies will vanish at once. Voices will leave no mark at all. Even the smell of smoke, strong now, will fade. What remains, if anything remains, will depend on conditions the hunter cannot control. This is why caves become so powerful in the prehistoric record. They preserve what ordinary life does not usually get to keep. In places like Blombos Cave in South Africa, for example, layers of cave deposits help to preserve evidence that shifted how scholars think about early human behaviour. Pieces of ochre, engraved with deliberate cross-hatched lines, shell beads with signs of wear, tools shaped with planning and consistency. These finds suggest that symbolic behaviour, the use of marks, ornament, and perhaps social meaning, appeared earlier than older models once assumed, not suddenly, as if the human mind switched on overnight, more gradually, more unevenly, appearing in places, disappearing, reappearing, like sparks catching under different conditions. That matters for your title's Missing Years. Because the cave record does not show a long empty silence so much as a broken signal. Some evidence survives, a great deal does not. And every new cave discovery can make the gap look different. The hunter lifts a stoneflake and turns it in his hand before placing it aside. It is sharp enough to cut skin if handled carelessly. It may be used, kept, dropped, stepped on, buried. If left behind and sealed beneath sediment, it could survive longer than any woodshaft, leather binding, or woven material used beside it. Stone outlasts the things that made it useful. That is why prehistoric archaeology often feels weighted towards stone. Not because early humans only lived by stone, but because stone survives when softer materials vanish. A person may have carried wooden containers, fibre cordage, skins, baskets, and tools shaped from bone or antler. Many of those would rot, crack, or disappear entirely under ordinary conditions. A cave may preserve a stone point. It rarely preserves the whole hand that used it. The group begins to pack. One woman gathers the remaining roots. The older man checks a bundle and reties it. The boy, now fully awake, tries to imitate the hunter's serious expression while carrying something small and unnecessary, determined to be included. A baby is lifted, settled against a shoulder, soothed back into quiet. For a moment, standing in the cave mouth, the hunter looks back at the fire scar. He is not thinking like an archaeologist. He is not imagining layers, dating methods, or future debates. He is simply checking that the place is safe to leave, that no spark remains where it should not, that what must be carried is carried, that the day can continue. But what he leaves behind, unintentionally, may matter more than what he takes. This is the strange balance of cave archaeology, intention and accident mixed together. The people who made the traces were not trying to send a message to the future. The people who find the traces are trying to rebuild a world from what was never meant to last. And so they study everything. They study charcoal to estimate age using radiocarbon where the material is young enough for that method. They use other dating techniques for deeper time, methods tied to minerals, sediments, and the physical changes in buried materials. They examine cut marks on bones, fracture patterns, residues on tools, microscopic wear. They compare layers. They compare sites. They ask whether a cave was a brief stop, a repeated seasonal shelter, a processing site, a place for ritual activity, or simply one pause among many in a mobile life. Most answers come slowly. Some remain uncertain. That uncertainty is not failure. It is honesty. The hunter steps out into the morning. Behind him, the cave returns to stillness, but not emptiness. The ash remains. A few flakes remain. Bits of bone, pressed soil, tiny traces no one in the group would ever count as meaningful, because meaning, for them, lives in people and movement, not in residue. Yet residue is what time can keep. For a while in softer patches, then fade for a while in softer patches, then fade across harder ground. A breeze lifts dust. Birds pick at what is left near the entrance. Insects begin their work. The cave waits. Days may pass before anyone enters again, or years, or longer. Another human band may come, build a new fire over old ash, scatter fresh flakes over earlier ones, leave beads, bones, pigment, footprints, and then leave as well. Layer after layer, not continuously, but in episodes, short occupations separated by silence. This is how a cave remembers, not like a story told from beginning to end, more like pages dropped out of order. A line here, a pause, another line centuries later. And yet even broken pages can change what we know. When archaeologists recover a burned hearth, they are not just finding a fire. They are finding planning, fuel gathering, repeated use of place, shared warmth, cooked food, time spent together. When they recover engraved ochre, they are not just finding a marked stone, they are finding intention beyond immediate survival. When they recover shell beads far from shore, they may be seeing movement, exchange, ornament, identity. Small objects, large meanings. The hunter and his group disappear into distance by late morning, swallowed by the scale of the land. If someone stood at the cave mouth and watched them go, they might soon lose sight of them entirely. Human life in this age is often like that. Present, then gone, with the world closing softly behind it. But the cave does not close completely. It holds on to what it can. Not enough to tell us everything. Enough to tell us we are not looking at emptiness. And that is the lesson of the cave before we even reach the missing years. The record is not silent because nothing happened. It is selective because survival itself is selective. Stone keeps a little. Ash keeps a little. Sediment keeps a little. And from those little things, a long human past begins to come back into view. When the wind reaches the cave entrance again that afternoon, it carries dust inside and lays it thinly over the fire scar, over the flakes, over the split bone and the scattered charcoal. A quiet covering, the first layer after departure. Another day will add another season another. 1,000 years if the cave is left mostly undisturbed. By then, the hunter's body will be gone, his voice gone, his route forgotten. The people he loved and walked beside will have vanished into generations no one can name. But in the cave, under dust and stone and time, the evidence of one ordinary night will remain. Not whole, never whole, but enough for memory to begin. The hunter walks away from the cave, and as his footprints fade in the dust, we enter the greatest mystery of our species. For nearly 100,000 years, the record goes quiet. We call them the missing years. But they aren't missing because nothing happened. They are missing because the most important revolution in history didn't happen in the dirt. It happened behind the eyes. Imagine a world where you have the hands of a creator, the legs of a traveller, but no words for yesterday, no concept of next year. For millennia, we were a species in a waiting room. We were anatomically modern, but internally, we were still asleep. But somewhere in the heat of the African savanna or the freezing shadow of a volcanic winter, the light switched on. This is the story of the invisible revolution, the moment we stopped just surviving the world and started dreaming it into existence. During these missing years, a major shift occurred in how humans function together, and much of the scientific community points toward the development of complex speech as the primary driver. While the exact origins of human language remain a mystery and a subject of intense debate, many researchers believe that this period saw the emergence of the biological hardware necessary for speech. From a biological perspective, scientists study specific regions of the brain, Broca's and Wernicke's areas, which are associated with the production and understanding of complex syntax. According to current scientific models, it was during this era that these structures became fully integrated, allowing for what linguists call displaced reference. This is the ability to transmit information about things that are not physically present, the ability to talk about yesterday or tomorrow. Consider the practical advantage this would have provided. In this view, a hunter returning to camp wouldn't just be making sounds, he would be providing data. He could describe the specific location, size, and direction of a herd that was still days away. This theory suggests a transition from individual observation to collective knowledge, creating a shared mental map within the community. Archaeology provides the physical evidence that supports this idea of high-level coordination. Throughout the fossil record of this era, we find skeletal remains with healed fractures, most notably severe breaks in the femur or the skull. From a historical standpoint, a broken leg in a harsh environment is a terminal injury for a solitary individual. The fact that these bones show signs of significant healing proves that these people were cared for by a group for months or even years. To sustain a wounded person, a group must be able to plan for a surplus of food and coordinate protection. Scientists interpret this as evidence of a sophisticated social contract, which many believe is only possible through a complex system of communication. As humans moved across open landscapes, they weren't just carrying stone tools. The evidence suggests they carried a collective intelligence. Whether this ability was a sudden click or a gradual development, it allowed for the preservation of survival strategies and technical skills across generations. The missing years are where we see the foundation of the social frameworks that define the human experience. Just as these new systems of communication and social coordination were beginning to take hold, the physical world underwent a transformation so violent that it remains etched into the very layers of the earth. Around 74,000 years ago, according to geological data, the horizon didn't just darken, it vanished. In a region we now know as Sumatra, a supervolcano named Toba erupted with a force that defies modern comparison. This wasn't merely a volcanic event. Scientists categorize it as a planetary reset. The evidence for this event is found in the deep ice cores of Greenland and Antarctica, where researchers have identified massive spikes in sulfuric acid. These chemical markers tell a story of billions of tons of ash and toxic gas being pumped into the upper atmosphere, creating a reflective shroud that drifted across the oceans and smothered the sun. For the people living through these missing years, the impact was catastrophic. Global temperatures plummeted, and in many regions the resulting drought caused a total collapse of local ecosystems. This period creates what many geneticists refer to as a genetic bottleneck. By analysing modern human mitochondrial DNA, some researchers propose a theory that the entire human population may have dropped to a staggeringly low number, perhaps as few as 3,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals. This theory suggests that we are all descendants of a tiny, resilient group of survivors who clung to the edges of a dying world. However, as with many aspects of deep history, this remains a subject of intense scientific debate. Other archaeological findings, such as those in the Jwalapuram Valley in India, show stone tools both above and below the Toba ash layer, leading some scholars to suggest that human populations were more resilient and widespread than the bottleneck theory implies. Regardless of the specific numbers, the physical reality of a sunless, volcanic winter would have tested the very limits of human capability. This is where the evidence of displaced reference and social coordination becomes a matter of life and death. In a world where the sun hasn't been seen in years, and the plants you rely on have withered under a grey, toxic frost, the old ways of solitary survival would have been insufficient. The geological record suggests that humans had to adapt their survival strategies with unprecedented speed. In the archaeological sites dating to this era, we see a shift toward what researchers call microliths, smaller, more versatile stone tools that could be adapted for a wider variety of prey. This suggests a high level of technical innovation. More importantly, the evidence points to a heavy reliance on refugia, specific geographic areas, such as the coastlines of South Africa, where the climate remains stable enough to support life. In these locations, we find some of the most compelling evidence of increased social complexity. When resources become scarce, the ability to coordinate becomes the primary survival mechanism. We find evidence of the long-distance transport of raw materials, such as silkcrete, which was heat-treated to make it easier to flake into tools. This process requires planning, fuel management, and a shared understanding of chemical properties, skills that many scientists believe were passed down through the complex language systems we discussed earlier. The transport of these materials across vast territories suggests that groups were not isolated. They were part of a larger network of exchange and movement. The Great Ash Winter was a test of resilience. To endure a decade of cooling and failing resources, these survivors had to double down on their social structures. They had to share dwindling resources, protect the vulnerable, and maintain a collective memory of where water and food might still be found. They didn't just survive as biological units, they survived as a community. Whether you view this survival as a result of a sudden evolutionary leap, or as a testament to the inherent resilience of the first families, the facts found in the earth tell a consistent story. We are the products of a moment when the world turned cold and the sky stayed black for years. The missing years were the era in which humanity proved it could not be extinguished by the elements. We are the descendants of the ones who sat in the dark, coordinated their efforts, and refused to disappear into the ash. When the hunter finally turned his back on the cave and stepped into the open air of the Pleistocene, he wasn't just entering a landscape of predators, he was entering a landscape of caloric scarcity. To understand the missing years, we have to move beyond the image of the hunter always standing over a kill. The reality of surviving 100,000 years was defined by the Great Hunger, the relentless daily scientific challenge of fueling a high-energy human body in an unpredictable world. If you were living in that era, your primary job wasn't just hunting, it was biological accounting. A modern human brain like the one our hunter possessed consumes about 20% of the body's total energy, despite making up only 2% of its weight. To keep that internal revolution running, the language, the coordination, the planning, the hunter needed a massive, consistent intake of fats and proteins. But the open world doesn't offer a steady menu. Research into this era uses stable isotope analysis and dental microwear to reconstruct exactly what was being consumed. By analysing the carbon and nitrogen isotopes preserved in ancient bone collagen, scientists can determine the ratio of plant-based proteins to animal proteins. the data shows a surprising diversity. While the missing years are often called the age of the hunter, the evidence suggests these people were master botanists. They had to be. In many regions, plants made up the vast majority of the daily caloric intake. The Great Hunger was solved through a deep, passed-down knowledge of the landscape. Imagine standing where the hunter stood, looking at a vast brown plain. To an untrained eye, it is empty. To the hunter, it is an integrated pharmacy and grocery store. He knew which tubers were buried deep enough to survive a drought, which seeds could be ground into a calorie-dense paste, and which fungi could heal an infection versus which would stop a heart. This is the birth of ethnobotany, the scientific study of how people use plants. Every time the group moved, they weren't just wandering, they were harvesting a seasonal map that had been memorized over generations. However, plants alone couldn't fuel the expansion of the human species. The missing years were also the era of the fat quest. In a world of lean wild game, fat was the most precious resource on Earth. When archaeologists study bone heaps at Middle Paleolithic sites, they look for spiral fractures. These are specific types of breaks made when a human strikes a long bone with a hammerstone to reach the marrow inside. Marrow and brain tissue are nearly 90% fat and are packed with essential fatty acids like DHA, which are critical for brain development. The archaeological record shows that humans weren't just eating the meat, they were systematically mining the skeletons of their prey. We find evidence of pitting on bones where stones were used to crack open every possible source of lipids. This wasn't just a meal, it was a high-level processing operation. If you lived then, you would understand that a single reindeer or bison wasn't just a pile of steaks, it was a complex kit of fuel, cordage, and tools. The Great Hunger also forced humans to become masters of the invisible harvest. In sites along the coast of South Africa, such as Pinnacle Point, we find some of the earliest evidence of humans systematically harvesting shellfish. This represents a massive shift in human logic. To harvest mussels or limpets safely, you have to understand the lunar cycle and the tides. You have to know when the water will retreat and for how long. This is the first evidence of humans using the architects of air to track celestial patterns for the sake of food security. Shellfish provided a stable, predictable source of protein and omega-3s that didn't require the high risk of a megafauna hunt. But what happened when the harvest failed? This is where the missing years reveal the most important survival strategy of all: food processing and storage. We see evidence of pitting and grinding stones that suggest humans were processing grains and nuts into forms that could be carried or kept. We also find evidence of heavy roasting, using fire to break down the tough cellulose in plants and to kill parasites in meat. Fire wasn't just for warmth, it was an external digestive system. By cooking their food, humans could extract more calories with less physical effort, freeing up time for the social coordination and symbolic marking we see at the end of the era. The physical toll of this Great Hunger is visible in the bones. We find Harris lines on the long bones of many early humans, mineralized ridges that indicate periods where growth completely stopped due to malnutrition or disease. These are the physical scars of winter. If you were living in that era, you carried the record of every hungry season you survived on your very skeleton. Yet despite the hunger, the record shows that these humans were thriving. They were expanding into the high-altitude regions of the Himalayas and the freezing tundras of the north. They did this by becoming the most efficient energy consumers the world had ever seen. They turned the missing years into a laboratory for survival, testing every root, every bone, and every tide. When the hunter walked away from that cave, he was carrying a mental library of the Earth's resources. He knew that survival wasn't a matter of luck, it was a matter of data. The Great Hunger didn't break the human spirit. It forced it to become more intelligent, more coordinated, and more innovative. We are the descendants of the ones who learned to see a meal where others saw only dirt and stone. We are the ones who turned the scarcity of the Pleistocene into the foundation of the human future. To understand the missing years, we have to look at the anatomy of stress, the physical toll that surviving the Pleistocene took on the human frame. If you were living in that era, your health was not a matter of luck. It was a visible manifestation of your environment. While the internal revolution gave us language and the ego, it did not exempt us from the laws of biology. Archaeologists and bioanthropologists use osteological analysis to study the bones of our ancestors, and what they find is a testament to extreme physical demand. One of the most consistent findings in the fossil record of this era is the density of the bone. According to Wolff's law, bone is a dynamic tissue that thickens in response to the stress placed upon it. The skeletons of the hunters from the missing years show cortical bone, the hard outer layer, that is significantly thicker than that of modern humans. This isn't a theory of evolution, it is a physical fact of life. These people were lifting, carrying and sprinting in ways that modern athletes would struggle to replicate. Their skeletons were over-engineered by the sheer necessity of their daily routines. However, this strength came at a high price. When researchers examine the joints of these early humans, they find evidence of degenerative joint disease or osteoarthritis in individuals who were likely only in their late 20s or 30s. The stress of carrying heavy carcasses over uneven terrain and the repetitive motion of napping stone tools left permanent marks on their spines, hips and shoulders. In the missing years, your body was your only machine, and like any machine, it wore down under constant use. Furthermore, the record shows a high frequency of traumatic injuries. In a study often cited by paleoanthropologists, the injury patterns found on early human remains, specifically those of Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, closely mirror those of modern professional rodeo performers. We find a high number of head, neck, and upper body fractures. This data suggests that hunting in this era was not a long-distance affair, it was an up-close, high-risk confrontation. To bring down a large herbivore with a handheld or short-range spear, the hunter had to be within striking distance of hooves and horns. Every successful meal was a brush with potential disability or death. But the anatomy of stress isn't just about broken bones, it's about the invisible scars of growth. When a child experiences a period of extreme fever or malnutrition, the development of their teeth and bones momentarily stops. This leaves behind linear enamel hyperplasia, permanent horizontal ridges on the teeth. When we look at the dental records of the missing years, these lines are nearly universal. They tell us that almost every survivor of the era had lived through a season of near starvation or severe illness. They were the ones who were strong enough to restart their growth after the crisis had passed. Living in this era also meant dealing with the founder effect and the reality of small group genetics. Because these populations were often isolated by geography or climate shifts, they faced a higher risk of genetic diseases being amplified within a tribe. Yet the archaeological record shows something that contradicts a purely survival of the fittest narrative. We find the remains of individuals with congenital deformities, people born with conditions that would make them unproductive in a traditional sense, who nonetheless lived into adulthood. This is the social bioarchaeology of the missing years. It proves that the community was actively mitigating the stress of the individual. Someone else carried the extra weight. Someone else gathered the extra tubers. This is the physical proof of the architects of air and the social contracts we discussed. The anatomy of stress shows us a body that was pushed to its breaking point, but it also shows a social structure that refused to let those individuals break alone. As the hunter finally disappears over the horizon, we realise that his story is etched into his very marrow. He was a creature of high-density bone and scarred enamel, a survivor of predators and pathogens, held together by the strength of his tribe. The 100,000 years we couldn't see are no longer a blank space in a textbook. They are a story written in the fractures that healed, the teeth that endured, and the social bonds that allowed a physically stressed species to eventually inherit the earth. The missing years are finally found. They are not in the distance, they are in the mirror. Every time you feel the strength in your own grip or the resilience of your own body, you are feeling the legacy of the hunter who stepped out of that cave and decided that the world was worth the struggle. While the anatomy of stress shows us the physical damage the environment inflicted upon the human frame, it doesn't tell the whole story. If we look closer at the archaeological record of the missing years, we find something far more shocking than just healed breaks. We find evidence of active, intentional medical intervention. This was the birth of the first surgeons, an era where humans stopped simply enduring injuries and began using their stone tools to fight back against death itself. From a research perspective, the most compelling data point for this is trepanation. This is the practice of drilling or scraping a hole into a living person's skull. While it sounds like a ritual of madness, bioanthropologists find that a staggering number of these skulls show signs of significant bone remodeling. This is a scientific fact. The bone began to grow back around the edges of the hole. This proves that the patient didn't just survive the procedure, they lived for years afterward. In an era without anesthesia or modern sterilization, the success rate of these surgeries suggests a deep, empirical understanding of human anatomy and the management of infection. If you were living in that era, the first surgeons weren't just guessing. They were applying the logic of the biological hard drive to the human body. They understood that pressure on the brain, caused by the traumatic head injuries common among the rival predators sections, could be relieved. To execute this, they used obsidian scalpels. Obsidian can be flaked to an edge that is 500 times sharper than a modern surgical steel blade, allowing for a level of precision that minimized tissue damage. This wasn't primitive hacking. It was a calibrated technical response to a medical crisis. But the first surgeons didn't just work on the surface. They were masters of the Pleistocene pharmacy. While the anatomy of stress showed us the scars of malnutrition, the chemical analysis of dental calculus, the fossilized plaque on teeth, shows us the cure. Researchers have found traces of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in modern aspirin, and penicillium, a natural antibiotic fungus, in the mouths of individuals who are suffering from severe dental abscesses or bone infections. This is a massive shift in how we view the missing years. It proves that humans were actively seeking out specific plants, not just for calories, but for chemistry. They were utilizing the songline science to remember which bark reduced a fever and which mold stopped a wound from festering. This represents the first evidence of pharmacological knowledge. They weren't just foragers, they were chemists who understood that the landscape provided a toolkit for biological repair. The evidence for active intervention extends to amputation. In recent findings from the late Pleistocene, archaeologists uncovered a skeleton where the lower leg had been surgically removed with incredible precision. The bone shows that the individual survived for another 6 to 9 years after the limb was taken. From a historical standpoint, this is a revolutionary find. To successfully amputate a limb in the wild, a surgeon must be able to manage blood loss, prevent shock, and keep the wound clean in a world full of invisible killers. This proves that the social contracts we discussed were backed by a sophisticated technical infrastructure. The first surgeons represent the ultimate victory of the internal revolution. They turned the stone that killed the mammoth into a tool that saved the child. They turned the language of the architects of air into a set of surgical instructions. The missing years reveal a species that refused to accept the laws of biology as a death sentence. By combining the social bond of the tribe with the empirical data of the landscape, we created a protective shell around the vulnerable. As we look at the evidence of these healed skulls and the traces of ancient medicine, the missing years lose their mystery. They become an era of incredible ingenuity. We aren't looking at primitive survivors. We are looking at the founders of the medical tradition. Every time you take a modern antibiotic or undergo a life-saving surgery, you are utilizing a system of logic that was perfected 100,000 years ago by people who refused to let their loved ones go quietly into the dark. While the first surgeons were looking inward at the mechanics of the human body, another group of specialists was looking outward, far beyond the reach of the firelight. To truly master the missing years, humans had to solve the greatest scientific mystery of all, the mystery of time. If you were living in that era, the sky wasn't just a ceiling, it was a massive rotating clock. Survival depended on knowing exactly when the great ash winter would ease, or when the great hunger would be broken by the return of the herds. To do this, humans became the first astronomers, using the stars to track cycles that spanned thousands of years. From a research perspective, the evidence for this is found in the mnemonic devices of the biological hard drive. Archaeologists have recovered bone fragments, such as the Blanchard bone from France and the Ashango bone from Africa, which are covered in precise intentional notches. When analysed through the lens of mathematical patterns, these marks are not random. Many researchers identify them as lunar calendars, the first physical records of humans tracking the 29-day cycle of the moon. This allowed for the lunar harvest. We discussed earlier to be predicted with scientific accuracy weeks in advance. But the first astronomers were tracking something much larger than just the months. They were tracking the precession of the equinoxes, a 26,000-year cycle caused by the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. While this sounds like a modern discovery, the cultural continuity of the missing years suggests a different story. In the cave systems of Lascaux and across the open-air promontories of the Levant, we find star maps depicted in charcoal and ochre. Researchers have identified the Seven Sisters, the Pleiades, and the constellation of Taurus hidden within what was once thought to be simple animal art. If you were living in that era, knowing the position of the stars was your GPS. The Great Migration across the Red Sea and into the unknown was not a blind walk. By aligning their movements with the rising and setting of specific constellations, the horizon chasers could maintain a straight course across featureless deserts and open oceans. This is the architecture of the sky, the logic that allowed a species with no compass to map an entire planet. They turned the biological hard drive into a celestial map, ensuring that no matter how far they travelled, the stars remained a familiar guide. This tracking had a deep impact on the anatomy of stress. By predicting the change of seasons with astronomical precision, humans could move their portable fortresses into refugia before the first snow fell. They weren't reacting to the environment, they were anticipating it. This proactive survival reduced the invisible scars of growth because it allowed for the storage of surplus food in preparation for the winter. The first astronomers were essentially the world's first risk managers, using the physics of the solar system to mitigate the brutality of the Pleistocene. The evidence for this high-level tracking is also found in the alignment of sacred geography. At Göbekli Tepe and other sites that mark the end of the missing years, we see massive stone pillars aligned with the winter solstice and the rising of Sirius. While these structures are younger than the 100,000-year gap, the level of mathematical precision they display proves that the data had been collected and passed down through the songline science for tens of thousands of years. You do not build a solstice-aligned temple without a 10,000-year history of observation. The first astronomers proved that the human mind was never primitive. During the missing years, we weren't just looking for the next meal. We were looking for the meaning of the universe. We were the first creatures to realise that the patterns in the sky matched the patterns on the ground. By mastering the stars, we mastered time itself. We turned the 100,000-year silence into a rhythmic, predictable cycle of life. As the hunter looks up from his hearth and sees the same stars we see tonight, he is the first to realise that he is part of something infinite. He isn't just a survivor in a cave, he is a navigator of the cosmos. The missing years conclude with a species that has finally found its place in the universe, not as a victim of the elements, but as the master of the clock. While the first astronomers were mapping the outer world, another scientific revolution was taking place in the dark. To understand the missing years, we have to listen to them. We often think of the Pleistocene as a time of silence, But the archaeological record shows it was an era of sophisticated acoustic engineering. Humans weren't just making noise, they were the first musicians, and they were using sound as a technical tool to bind their communities together and navigate the internal revolution. From a research perspective, the hard evidence is found in organology, the study of musical instruments. At sites like Hohlefels in Germany and Isteritz in France, archaeologists have recovered flutes carved from the wing bones of vultures and the ivory of mammoths. These are not toys. When scientists analyse the spacing of the holes, they find that they are calibrated to produce specific scales. This is a scientific fact. 35,000 to 40,000 years ago, humans had already mastered the physics of airflow and pitch. These instruments were part of the biological hard drive, used to encode the songline science we discussed earlier. If you were living in that era, music was a survival technology. In the anatomy of stress, we saw how isolation and trauma affected the tribe. Music served as a social glue. By synchronizing their movements and voices, a group could lower their collective cortisol levels and increase oxytocin, the bonding hormone. This allowed the architects of air to maintain the social contracts necessary to survive the Great Ash Winter. It wasn't just art, it was a biological intervention to ensure the group stayed coordinated under extreme pressure. But the first musicians didn't just play instruments, they played the landscape. Researchers in the field of archaeoacoustics have found that in caves like Lascaux or Altamira, the locations with the most intense ego in the stone paintings are also the locations with the best resonance. If you clap or sing in these spots, the sound echoes and vibrates through the body. This suggests that humans were using the caves as resonant chambers. They were mapping the acoustic maps of the underground, using sound to find their way in the dark, where the master of the flame's torch couldn't reach. This mastery of sound extended to the apex rivals as well. Many indigenous cultures use sound mimicry to hunt, and the survivors of the missing years were likely masters of this. By utilising the architects of air logic, they could mimic the calls of their prey or the warnings of birds to track predators in the open-air camps. Music and mimicry were a form of bioacoustic camouflage, allowing humans to hide in plain sight or lure a meal into the fat quest trap. The evidence for this high-level acoustic science is also found in the lithophones. In many Paleolithic sites, archaeologists have found specific stones that have been struck repeatedly, not to make tools, but because they ring with a musical tone when hit. These rock gongs were part of the sacred geography. They served as long-distance communication devices, much like the songline science used for navigation. A single strike on a resonant rock could signal the return of a hunting party or the approach of a threat across miles of open tundra. The first musicians proved that the missing years were full of colour and sound. We didn't just survive the elements, we harmonised with them. We turned the hollow bones of the animals we hunted into tools for the spirit. We turned the cold stone of the cave into a symphony hall. By mastering the physics of sound, we created a language that transcended the architects of air, a language of pure emotion and data that could be felt as much as heard. As the hunter plays his flute by the hearth, he isn't just entertaining himself. He is reinforcing the biological hard drive of his people. He is telling the story of the Great Migration and the Great Ash Winter through melody. The missing years conclude with a species that has learned to sing its own history. We aren't just the survivors of the Pleistocene, we are its composers. When we look back at the missing years, we often focus on the hard evidence, the stone, the bone, and the hearth, but there was a soft revolution happening alongside the stone tools that was just as critical for the Great Migration. To survive the extreme climates of the Pleistocene, humans had to solve a complex engineering problem: how to bind the world together. If you were living in that era, you were likely one of the first weavers. While the anatomy of stress showed us the physical toll of the environment, it was fibre technology that allowed us to engineer our way around it. From a research perspective, fibre is notoriously difficult to track because it rots. However, in the microscopic record of sites like Tsutsuana Cave in Georgia, archaeologists have found a data goldmine. They discovered microscopic wild flax fibres that had been intentionally twisted and dyed in colours like turquoise, pink, and black. This is a scientific bombshell. 30,000 years ago, humans weren't just using raw plant material, they were using fibre chemistry and complex knotting. This represents the birth of string theory, the realization that twisting small fibres together creates a force stronger than the sum of its parts. If you were living in that era, string was your most versatile tool. It allowed for the creation of compound tools. Without cordage, the apex rivals hunters only had handheld spears. With string, they could lash a microlith to a wooden shaft, creating the first arrows and harpoons. This is the architecture of the bind. It allowed the architects of air to turn separate objects into a single unified machine. String also enabled the creation of nets and snares, allowing for a passive harvest of small game and fish, significantly reducing the anatomy of stress by providing a safer, more consistent calorie source than the megafauna hunt. But the first weavers didn't stop at tools. They engineered the first environmental suits. While the master of the flame provided warmth at night, woven and sewn clothing provided a mobile microclimate. At sites across Eurasia, we find bone needles with eyes so small they rival modern steel needles. This proves that humans were performing high-precision tailoring. They weren't just draping furs, they were creating layered, fitted garments that trapped air for insulation. This technology was the invisible engine of the Great Migration, allowing humans to step into the Arctic tundra, where the Great Ash Winter was at its most lethal. The evidence for this textile science is also found in the Venus figurines. When analysed with a high-powered lens, these carvings, often thought of only as art, show detailed representations of woven hats, belts, and string skirts. This is the ego in the stone, recording the ego in the fibre. It shows that 25,000 years ago, humans were already using textiles to signal status, identity, and group belonging. The patterns of the weave were like a biological hard drive, carrying the specific branding of a tribe across thousands of miles. Furthermore, fibre technology allowed for the creation of carrying containers. In the Great Hunger section, we talked about gathering tubers and grains, but how do you transport 50 pounds of food back to the open-air camp without a bag? The invention of the woven basket and the net bag allowed for the mass transport of resources. This changed the bioarchaeology of place, as it allowed groups to stay in one refugia for longer by bringing the landscape to the hearth, rather than moving the hearth to the landscape. The first weavers proved that the missing years were an era of intricate, soft technology. We didn't just smash our way through the Pleistocene with rocks, we wove our way through it with string. We turned the plants of the field into nets, clothes, and containers. By mastering the science of fibre, we bound the tribe together, literally and figuratively. As the weaver sits by the fire, twisting flax into cordage, they are creating the first internet, a web of connections that allowed for the Great Migration and the first sailors to succeed. The missing years conclude with a species that has learned to tie the world together. We are the descendants of the ones who realised that the smallest fibre, when twisted with others, could change the course of history. While the first weavers were binding the physical world, another group of specialists was beginning to bind the social world through a new kind of logic, the logic of the debt. To understand the missing years, we have to look at the first accountants. We often assume that math and trade began with the first cities, but the archaeological record shows that the scientific tracking of value and quantity is tens of thousands of years older than the first coin. If you were living in that era, your survival depended on your ability to track the invisible ledger, the complex web of who owed what to whom. From a research perspective, the primary evidence is found in tally sticks. At sites like the Border Cave in South Africa and the Ashango site in the Congo, researchers have found baboon fibulas and other bones marked with precise, intentional notches. When these are analysed mathematically, they aren't just random scratches. The Ashango bone, for example, features 3 columns of notches that some mathematicians argue represent prime numbers and a base 10 system. This is a scientific fact. 20,000 to 40,000 years ago, humans were already using quantitative notation. They were externalizing their biological hard drive into the first spreadsheets in history. If you were living in that era, accounting was a survival mechanism for the Great Hunger. By tracking the number of lunar cycles since the last herd migration, or the number of baskets of grain stored in a refugia, a group could calculate their burn rate, how long their resources would last through the winter. This represents the birth of economic forecasting. They were using the architects of air logic to turn physical objects into abstract numbers, allowing for the management of a surplus. Without this accounting, the birth of the village would have collapsed into chaos within a single season. But the first accountants weren't just counting food, they were managing trade networks. One of the most compelling data points in the missing years is the movement of obsidian and rare shells. In the Mediterranean and across Africa, archaeologists find obsidian, a volcanic glass, hundreds of miles away from its only possible source. To move a material across that distance, you need a trade protocol. You need to know the value of a piece of obsidian versus a pile of cured hides. This is the birth of comparative value. The evidence for this trade is found in the lithic analysis of sites. We see foreign stones appearing in local toolkits, often processed with the same precision as the master of the flame's heat-treated silkrete. This proves that groups were not isolated. They were engaged in a multi-group economy. To manage this, the first accountants likely used token systems. Small shaped stones or specific shells, like the Nassarius beads we discussed, acted as a medium of exchange. They were a way to bank value so it could be moved across the great migration routes. This financial revolution also required the management of social debt. In small group genetics and social bioarchaeology, we saw how the group cared for the injured. This care wasn't just charity, it was part of a reciprocal ledger. By contributing to the tribe today, the hunter was depositing into a social bank that would support him when he faced the anatomy of stress later in life. The first accountants were the ones who kept track of these social obligations through the songline science, ensuring that the social contract remained balanced. Furthermore, we see the first evidence of standardization. In the toolkits of the missing years, we find stone points that are nearly identical in weight and dimension. This suggests a quality control that can only come from a shared measurement system. Whether they used a handspan or a thumb width, they were using the first standardized units of measure to ensure that a spear point made by one person would fit the shaft made by another. This is the foundation of interchangeable parts and industrial logic. The first accountants proved that the missing years were an era of high-level abstract thought. We didn't just find things, we valued them. We didn't just hunt, we budgeted. By mastering the science of numbers and trade, we created a system that allowed the tribe to become greater than the sum of its individuals. As the accountant marks a new notch on a bone by the fire, he is creating the future of the human race. He is building the logic of the bank, the market, and the state. The missing years conclude with a species that has learned to count its blessings and its debts. We are the descendants of the ones who realized that to own the world, you first had to be able to measure it.